So I'm delighted to be on the sofa with Vinca Petersen, and this is her very well-known book, No System, and we've just acquired the original prints from the book, so I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to ask Vinca a few questions. So tell me a bit about how you got involved with this set of travellers in the first place.
Yeah, good question. I think I was the youngest of 6 kids and very kind of bored at home, lived in the middle of nowhere. And the minute I could leave school, I did. So that was 16 back then. And I kind of came up with this idea that I was going to go to art college in London. I never made it. I got as far as London and then discovered the squatting scene in London, which was kind of, I guess for me, it was everything that I hadn't had. It was a sense of community, a sense of family, but of people, like-minded people. And
At this point,
yeah.
were you a photographer at this point at all?
Well, the only thing I can say to that is I've got a set of prints that say that my first photos on them, and first is spelt like with an E, so I must have been at sort of pre kind of spelling age when I started taking pictures. So yeah, I mean, what's a photographer? I took pictures, definitely. But I had no intention of using them for anything other than to remember things by, I think, at the time.
So the journey that is illustrated in this book, it was over Europe, over many different countries, and I guess over many, many years.
Yeah, so, I mean, it started sort of in the very early 90s, just before the criminal justice bill came into effect. And then at that point, the big raves and parties and traveller sort of gatherings that were taking part sort of went to Europe, and I photographed them for the next probably 10 years or so. But in this book, it's about a decade's worth of photographs. But I didn't intend to make a book with them, and I think that's the interesting thing was that at the time, the idea for me of photographing for anyone else other than the people I was with was not in my mind, but I did want to create a kind of a record of it, not just because my memory was awful for various reasons, but because no one else was really photographing, and I guess I had a value in myself to record them and what they were doing, and I knew there was a lot going on that I wouldn't remember. And it just every day was so filled with sort of experiences. And I remember thinking, I don't want to forget half of this. I had a sense that something was going on that was extraordinary, I suppose. So I photographed, yeah.
And how did you sustain yourself when you're on the road?
Yeah, good question. Well, we didn't need a lot of money. We kind of lived communally. We lived in vehicles. We lived sort of week to week, really. So we'd do, I mean, in the ideal situation, we would put on an illegal rave or a free party or whatever you want to call it every weekend. So in that sense, each group I was with at the time would be based around a sound system, and that sound system would put on a rave on, say, a Saturday night and do a big bar, sell drinks, sell mixtapes, sell t-shirts, sell anything, sell all sorts of things, and that would sustain you either as a group or as individuals till the next party, really.
How would you get the people to come? Because I guess this is before the time that social media really kicked off.
Yeah, so we would, I mean, the most fun thing, we would design a flyer, so there were often people amongst us that were better at that sort of thing, so there'd be an artist that would often be the one that would be the flyer designer, and they would design a flyer, we'd go to a copy shop, copied loads of them, cut them all up, and literally go out into the town, and kind of sometimes you'd dress up and go around, or sometimes you'd sort of drive a kind of strange looking vehicle around and hand them out and put them in bars, and you'd find the local record shops, and then you'd even try and get on local radio, the DJs would, and try and sort of do a spot and then advertise it. So yeah, there was no internet at all. I think there were a few mobile phones around, but I mean, generally it was done like that. Yeah, or word of mouth. I mean, sometimes we'd do parties in established squats, so in Italy, for example, there were a lot of these what were called centros sociales, which were like sort of buildings that had been taken over but were sort of semi-legal, as it were, and they would often sort of put on parties for the weekend.
And travellers are notoriously wary about being photographed, so clearly you got full access because you were part of the team, but did you have to discuss with them the rules of what you would be doing with the pictures and such like? And did they know that it would go towards a book?
I mean, I remember it all being very smooth and easy, but I also remember being aware of the fact that no one else could do what I was doing. So I would always have a camera on me, and it was a very unintrusive camera, a very small camera, and often I didn't even look through it. If I was photographing you, I'd just hold it there. And people just got so used to me having a camera. I lived with them day in, day out. But if someone would arrive, say, at a party with a camera, and this was film cameras in those days, they would just start photographing anything other than maybe just their own friends. They wouldn't be allowed to, there was a big thing then. I mean, the only way you could be caught in those days were through either your passport or your number plate on your vehicle. So people were very sensitive about photographs of their faces or photographs of their vehicles. But because I was just there every day doing it, they got used to it, I suppose.
And is this because these raids were technically illegal?
Yeah, completely illegal. And some of the people, were sort of not really on the run, but wanted to live in a way that they didn't want to be recorded, and they didn't want anyone to know where they were. They weren't necessarily criminals, but they might be people that had been doing raids for years and, just wanted to slip under the radar. I mean, I saw people having film ripped out of their cameras and stuff like that, but also it was just the feeling around a camera was very different then. If you got a camera out, it was quite a moment, whereas now everyone's photographing everything. So
and I assume there's a lot of drug culture there as well, which I guess people are also wary about being documented.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting thing. Among people always assume there were a lot of drugs around the sort of sound system. I mean, there was lots of drugs at the parties, generally what I would call party drugs. So, drugs that people could still function and enjoy themselves on, not the really dark stuff, which tended to be in other places. But people that sold those drugs tended to be quite separate from the sound systems, because as a group of people travelling with a big sound system in the back of your trucks, you were such a magnet for police that it wasn't like a great idea to be taking drugs around with you. So there were often people that arrived that could be our friends or whatever that would come and bring drugs to the parties, but kind of give us all free stuff, which was fine, and it was... Like I say, it wasn't really the kind of really heavy stuff that wasn't encouraged at all, and it was, there were places you could go and do that if you wanted, but it wasn't really at our parties generally.
And how did the book finally come to be published?
Well, it's a longish story, but to cut it short, I had a friend that was a photographer in London called Corinne Day, and I'd met her through doing a video for her boyfriend, actually, a music video for her boyfriend Mark Stasi, and she was kind of fascinated by this, I guess, subculture, whatever you want to call it, and she would always want to see all my photographs, and she'd give me film. She even gave me a camera once, or maybe even twice, and she would encourage me to print everything and show her. And so one day I was like, okay, all these travellers were asking me for copies of pictures, and that was a big difficult thing to do. So rather than kind of trying to remember who wanted a copy of what picture or whatever, I thought, well, I'll make 10 photo albums. I'll do one for each of the big sound systems I'd travelled with. And I'd just give it to them as a group and say, here, So I'd sort of put this idea together in my head of what this photo album would look like. And I said to Corinne, how can I reproduce this sort of 10 times cheaply? And she sort of said, publish it. And I said, oh, you must be joking. Absolutely, there's no way, I'll just get lynched, everyone's going to hate me, they'll think I've made money out of a free scene, forget it. But she was kind of quite gently persuasive, and she said, oh, just meet this friend of mine called Michael, who's doing a book with me, and, you can have it all your own way. So I met Mac, and I basically said, it has to be exactly my design, my edit, my everything, and I need a year to go and talk to all the travellers, and it needs to be ridiculously cheap so everyone can either have one or afford one. And he said yes to everything. So then I took the first maquette of the book, which you've got, out on the road for a year, and nearly all the travellers said the same thing. They said, oh, no, you can't do that. No, well, actually, if I get one, maybe that'd be all right, And that was it. They wanted they wanted it because it was their family photo album, basically.
The irony is, of course, that it's now become a very collectible book, and rather than the cheap book that you originally hoped for, it's now become very expensive. How do you feel about that?
All right, because it's beyond my control. I did my best. I said to Gerhard Steidl it had to be less than a tenner, which is I know people that everyone can get a tenner together. So he kind of said it could be a really small book for that much, and by the end of all our meetings it became this huge book and was still a tenner, and I think he lost money on it or whatever. He didn't care. So the feeling in the original book was great, and I'm hoping we're going to do a re-edition of it. The fact that it costs a fortune is unfortunate, but I think when I realised it was getting really expensive, what I did is I photographed the whole book and put it on my website so people can see it for free. But yeah, ideally it would be available in a tenner still. And what I felt with No System, and what I've always felt, is that I want to protect people that are living or choose to live like that. So I don't want to kind of... It feels a bit cheap for me to kind of use classic things that are sort of shocking to make something more interesting. And I think, yes, I can talk about interesting, slightly crazy things that went on, but I'm not desperate enough to do that, and I would rather protect people's lifestyles, I suppose.
And
I could have put drugs in here, I could have put, people upset, fights, blood, whatever, but I chose not to, because that wasn't what I was wanting to show people, and people can read between the lines, and life is life. But there's a lot of photography out there that shows that type of stuff.
And have you kept in touch with people from these days?
Yeah,
and what are they
I
all
could,
doing?
or I could, is another strange thing, is I could just... I've explained to my partner once this interesting feeling that I have when I go somewhere, and I pretty much know I could go to any city in Europe and look up someone and they'd let me stay with them, or a friend of a friend, or someone that knew them, and they would still let me come and stay. So there's this sense of sort of community and family that's it's definitely still there, it doesn't go. What was your question again?
Well, I'm just curious to know whether all the people here now sort of settled down and have kids and houses and jobs.
They've gone everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
The most interesting and kind of obvious thing that happened to some of them was they started organising big events. So they get involved with Glastonbury and the out of hours fields and do these amazing things, do what we were doing here but with huge budgets, so like their imaginations can go wild. And then there are others that turn their back on the whole thing completely because it created problems for them. There are people that have died. There are all sorts of things. There are kids that were there that have grown up to become, all different sorts of people. Yeah.
And is this scene still going on with another generation? I mean, has it been replenished by the next set of kids who are on the road?
There are lots of sort of splinter kind of things going on. There are still illegal raves in London. There are big, what they call now, technivals in Europe. So there's one huge one that goes off in France every year. I think it's called French Tech. So that's when a lot of sound systems gather together and do these huge parties. So it's still going on, but it's just different. It feels different to me. So it started to feel different, and I started to leave at a certain point. Things change, and I change. The drugs change. The music changed. The attitude changes, but it becomes something else. So I'm sure for those people that are experiencing it now, it's great for them in that way, but not for me anymore.
And I guess the introduction of social media would have also made a big difference.
Yeah.
Because you must have been in more of an isolated, roving community then, and now
Yeah.
everyone can know about what you're doing if you want it to be spread out.
Yeah, but I kind of imagine that a lot of that stuff would if I imagine what it was like travelling as a sound system trying to put on illegal parties, for example, the last thing you want is too much access to you outside of what you're doing. So yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose, yeah, we were completely isolated, yes, and a lot of stuff happened word of mouth or telephone calls or whatever, and now it's much easier to spread the word. But I imagine these parties are still just about getting there and being there. And yeah, I guess they get photographed more and shared more, but it was such a kind of live experience, I'm sure it still is.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.